All right, welcome to the AdaptX podcast, where we are joined by guests who are building accessible businesses or products, advocating for inclusion, or excelling in adaptive sports. Our intention is never to speak on behalf of those with disabilities, but rather advocate on their behalf and amplify their voice. Today I am joined by Georgia Carmichael, a world-class athlete who has been dealt with a rather unfortunate hand. This is a conversation that I've been looking forward to for a while, joining us all the way from Great Britain, right? Yeah,
Yes, yeah.
from overseas. So, Georgia, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe let's start with your first introduction to sports. So, kayaking was your passion. So, kind of when were you first introduced to the sport? How old were you when you started?
So I started when I was 10, just because the area I lived in is a very water sport based town, and it was the year of the Olympics. And so I was kind of motivated by that, and I started kayaking. And I came off the water after my first session, and I told my mum I was going to go to the Olympics. So very early on, it became my big dream.
Maybe it's not quite as popular in the States, in the US here, but maybe for people that aren't familiar with the sport as a whole, can you maybe summarize what competition's like, kind of how courses are structured?
Yeah, so I do both kayaking and rowing. So they're both flat water. The kayaking consists of sprints or marathons. So sprints are generally, 200, 500, 1,000 meters. A marathon depends on your age. So as a junior, it was kind of up to about 25 kilometers. And then obviously rowing, you have normally just a 2 kilometer race, so 2,000 meters.
Okay. Are the boats different? Is the composition of people in the boat different?
Yeah, so with kayaking, you have like K1, K2, and K4, and it stands for kayak one, kayak two. So how many people are in the boat? And then rowing, you can also have the same one, two, four, and also eight.
Okay. So at 15, you represented your country at the World Championships. Maybe explain a little bit about that experience and the success of it.
Yeah, so I went in kind of the underdog. I was the youngest to ever go. So no one really knew what was coming out of it. We kind of were told this is going to be a big lesson for you, and that would be good to learn from the older athletes. And I just remember being on the start line, this tiny 15-year-old surrounded by all these very strong looking 18-year-olds that to me at that time looked old. So it's quite daunting, but yeah, it was very exciting at the same time.
What was the distance for that race?
So in this one, I was doing because it was marathons, but you also have a short course added in. So it was a 5 kilometer race as well as the 21 kilometer race.
Oh, wow. How long does that take, the longer, the 21 kilometer?
It takes about an hour and a half because you also have something called portages during it. So portages is where you have to get out and run with your boat. Usually in the UK, it's on rivers over these like locks that you can't paddle through. And so to keep it, continuous with all the races, they added it in. And so a lot of beach portages, we have to literally jump out your boat halfway through paddling into shallow water and then run maybe about, up to 200 meters.
Okay. All right. I hadn't even envisioned that that was part of the event as a whole. That's interesting. So shortly after that success, just through some of the stuff I've read, refer to it as an injury, an accident. Can you maybe kind of take us through what happened and maybe symptomatically what you were feeling and then how that manifested?
Yeah, so obviously returned from winning the two golds at the World Championships, returned home, and shortly after I fell from a height and hit the back of my head, which unfortunately led to my first brain injury. So obviously being 15, it was tough and I wasn't very aware for a little while, but it was, a challenge to get back. I lost my memory, a lot of it. So, counting and some words were quite tricky and like naming things, as well as I didn't have any balance and coordination. So I kind of had to relearn that, which took a long time to, relearn walking. So I spent a couple of months in the hospital before I returned home. And the first thing I wanted to do was obviously get back in my boat and get back training.
Yeah. So it was a TBI. It wasn't a spinal cord injury.
No, so at this time it was a traumatic brain injury.
And then symptomatically, is that when you were initially diagnosed with FND, or was that a later?
Yeah, so that time I was diagnosed. Obviously, we found out later misdiagnosed, but at that point, I was diagnosed with a neurological condition because no one could really understand what was going on at the point. Like there was some things that just didn't add up, and they didn't know. It wasn't so problematic at the time because I did recover quite quickly and got back to my sport and kind of put it behind me.
So was there questioning in the medical community as to like how symptoms were um, being demonstrated and stuff? Like, were people doubting, I guess, the validity of it?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I was quite a confusing case, and no one really knew what was going on. Hence, why I got put under this label, because they use this label a lot to kind of put things they don't understand into. And at that time, even though it was a few years, the testing for what I now found out I have wasn't really that good. So they hadn't even questioned kind of continuing testing, and they were just waiting and seeing to see if I got better and if I recovered.
Yeah. So what did it end up being diagnosed as?
So I was only diagnosed this year with something called MELAS. It's a mitochondrial disorder. And obviously, it's taken us 6 years to get to that diagnosis, mainly because of the fact it's so rare and I have it sporadically. So, my mum doesn't have it, it's usually genetic, but no one in my family has it. But also, I've got it as late onset, so later. And it was only diagnosed because it had progressed so much that it was showing up more on scans and tests. And even in those few years, 6 years, the testing devices and stuff had advanced enough to get the diagnosis.
So was it a product of that accident, or was it a genetic condition that would have manifested either way?
So this is what they're still researching because before that date, I had no issues before the injury. And obviously mitochondria is your energy, so they're like, how are you an elite athlete and things like that. So it's quite confusing at the moment. We don't really know, but they're thinking that it was always dormant and I always had it. And obviously a trigger to my nervous system, let alone all the other injuries I had, must have just been too much for my body. And so it started to progress and manifest a lot quickly.
So after that first accident, you were 16, right? Around 16,
Yeah, I
15.
was 16.
You returned to kayaking, competed at a high level again at 17. So that was just in traditional kayaking, right? Not Paralympic.
No, so this was traditional kayaking, and I was also doing rowing at this point too. But it was just, yeah, I was with the able-bodied athletes at this point because I'd made that full recovery.
Mm-hmm. And then, did you happen to have another accident or another injury that?
Yeah, so when I was 16, so that year, amazing, that I went back to Worlds and got two silvers. I went to the Junior Olympics and was traveling all over the world competing. And unfortunately, in the December that year, when I was 16, I had another brain injury in a bit of a freak accident. But this one was a lot worse. This was a traumatic brain injury where I spent the next 3 months in intensive care and then went on to spend 9 months in rehabilitation, kind of relearning to talk, relearning to eat. And I had no movement from the neck down, so I had to relearn kind of all movements again.
And how long? You said you were 9 months in rehab.
Yeah, so in total it was a year in hospital, and 9 months in rehabilitation center, going through 4 hours of physio a day, and things like that.
What was that kind of like from I guess a mindset standpoint? So you're a world class athlete, and then you have this accident that puts you into a year long battle to kind of get back to where you were. Were there specific factors that were motivating or kind of that kept you engaged during that process?
I think a lot of the time I tended to try and treat my physio sessions like training and like a race. You leave nothing behind, you give it your all. And so that's kind of the approach I took. And then also, I'd always envision when I was 15 crossing that line, knowing I'd just won the world championship from the youngest to do it, like that feeling. I would visualize that and know that I wanted to get that feeling again. I wanted to get back in my boat. I wanted to go and win again. So that for me was a huge kind of motivator during it.
So you started rehab with paralyzed from the neck down, and when you finished rehab, what were your physical like symptoms and abilities?
So yeah, so when I went home, I was still paralyzed kind of from the waist down. and I still had some issues with kind of eating and talking, but it was a lot better. And I decided I just needed to get home because I wanted to get back in my boat. So I went home, and a week later, sat in my boat, still unable to use my legs, but I was off, and it felt like I hadn't, not been there that whole time.
Yeah.
And I knew from that moment, I'm going to get better. And 6 weeks later, I started walking.
So, do you know, or do doctors know, kind of what happened between that time where you had no function below the hip or below the waist, and then to the point where you were walking again? Was there any connection between the two, or?
Yeah, so I think for me and what we think is, being back in a boat where I trained for so long and spent so many hours in, it was kind of like muscle memory for me. And, that neuroplasticity kicked in, and it all just seemed to connect together, as well as, in my mind and my mindset improved even more because once I was back in that boat, I just knew this is what I wanted and I was going to fight for it. And I'm still doing rehab every day at home and things like that. And it became more sport orientated for me. And I'm a very competitive individual, so that really helped to enhance my rehab.
Were there barriers to getting back into the sport from like an accessibility or a physical standpoint?
Yeah, like a lot of my local clubs weren't the most accessible, so it was quite hard to get down and get into the boat and train. So a lot of time people would have to lift me down steps and things like that, which is quite tricky. And at the time, I didn't have an adapted boat, so I did fall out a lot because obviously without the use of my legs, balancing was a lot harder.
Yeah.
But over time, this did improve, and obviously there were still issues like because I didn't really have sensation, I'd get sores a lot on in from the boat. So there were things we had to kind of adapt around, and that took a little bit of time to get used to, but we got there.
Was it at this point where you entered the gateway program for Paralympics, or?
Yeah, so originally I did, and then I actually was able enough to go back fully to the team I was in before. So I did go back to that team in the end for a couple of years until the other accident, which is then when I became the Paralympic athlete.
Can you maybe take us through that transition between the two? Did it feel different? Was there any feeling of like less than, or did it just kind of feel like a natural evolution and like a just I guess a different competition?
At first, it was hard, obviously, like leaving my teammates and everything, and I think it was quite hard. I love the sport, but it just felt so different now, and it was quite a big barrier for me at first. I didn't really want to accept it, and I just continued to want to train with my old team, and that was quite a big mind thing I had, like battle I had to get through. But at the end of the day, I was able to do the sport I loved. So I was just grateful that I could be back on the water where I loved being.
Yeah. Are Paralympics big in your country, or do they have a strong presence? Yeah.
Yes, especially for the rowing team. I mean, recently, for example, they've just come back from World Championships and all the boats have qualified for Paris and they've gone loads of them have had world records and stuff. So over here, the rowing and Paralympic team is big and really well funded. So obviously that's really good.
When was timeline wise? When were you competing, and kind of I guess when was the last time you competed?
So the last time I was competed was earlier this year in February.
Okay.
So I had two competitions that month, in one in rowing, which was trials to get through to the next stage for, Paris, and then the other one was a CrossFit competition. So obviously doing the other sport I did, which was adapted CrossFit.
Yeah, cool. And for the last, how long have you been in the hospital now? 4 or 5 months.
So I've now been in hospital for 5.5 months, coming up to 6 months, a little
So,
while.
what happened between those last competitions and then your current stint in the hospital?
So in it was end of March, I just got really poorly all of a sudden, and there was no accident or anything. I just collapsed at home, and we came in. I was back in intensive care, and we were told I had a spinal stroke. So obviously at this point, we still didn't have a full diagnosis, and then this is when the testing began, and I got moved to a specialist hospital in London, where the mitochondrial condition was found, which basically between now and the first accident, I've had many ITU admissions that have never been explained, and no one's really know what's going on. So now we do have answers for that, and this mitochondrial condition is to blame for a lot of what I've gone through. And obviously, yeah, so this spinal stroke, having been so high up, paralyzed me from the neck down. And the first few weeks, talking, my vision was affected. And with MELAS, you get lactic acidosis and like strokes. So it can cause lesions on my spine or my brain, which is what happened in this case.
And that's when you first got introduced to like MELAS as a diagnosis was this most recent hospital
Yeah,
stay.
yes. Yeah, so it wasn't until it would have been June that I got diagnosed because it does take months. And I mean, we still have many unanswered questions at the moment, but it takes a lot of time. I mean, the muscle biopsy takes 6 months to come back.
Well, okay. All right. Yeah, it's a rare condition, so I'm guessing that most people that are listening aren't familiar with it. So, um, do you know enough to maybe give like a little bit of a synopsis of what it's like and kind of what the treatment is, what the physio is?
Yeah, of course. So mitochondrial disorders, basically your mitochondria produce 90% of your energy in your body and your cells. So when you have this depletion of mitochondria, it affects how your body reacts to things. So for me, it's infection. So an infection can very quickly become life-threatening. And anything that's too much for my body, so any illness can cause these metabolic strokes. And it's basically kind of an autoimmune where it's through my metabolic, mitochondrial, and nervous system. So they're all combined. And yeah, it can cause things like seizures, vision issues, hearing issues. And usually it is diagnosed when you're a child, you're normally born with it. And it is an incurable disease. I mean, it was only discovered, mitochondrial disorders were only discovered 30 years ago. So in medical world, it's still a very new discovery. So there's not much treatment options out there yet. And physio, obviously, I have the spinal point of view of the physio, the spinal injury treatment. But then there's also this area of we have to be careful I don't push my body too much because obviously energy is a big thing too.
Yeah. So you've been in the hospital since March. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
What does a typical day look like? And I guess kind of what's like the outlook? Kind of what are you working towards, or what are the qualifications, I guess, that you have to meet to be discharged or head back home, or what's preventing you from heading home?
Yeah, so I mean, a kind of a day in the hospital, it's not the most exciting, but hopefully I have physio every day, which is just like for like 45 minutes, an hour sometimes. Lots of friends and family coming in and bringing me food that's edible, unlike the hospital food. And it's a lot of like consultations with doctors and things like that. And at the moment, we are in the process of planning home, but we also have been for 2 months because it is quite complex. Like, obviously, I did come into hospital in a wheelchair, but now because of the damage and my physical ability, I need a more supportive one. So my having to be more adapted, care put in place, but also, the doctors do tell me, it's all about care and comfort. It's not about treatment. So they see MELAS or mitochondrial as a terminal diagnosis because there is no treatment out there. But then I see it as they don't know much about it. I'm already a very rare case as it is. So they don't know what the outlook is. So for me, that's a positive thing because as soon as I'm home, I'm going to get back into the gym and back to training because after all, training sort of saved my life so many times, being physically fit. Going into all these injuries and setbacks, my body's had a better baseline than maybe some others.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, they typically say with TBIs and SCIs, the more fit you were before the accident, the more likely you will be to recover or at least improve from a baseline standpoint. I just like I guess, I know you've been on a couple different podcasts and recently, and it's tough to like ask about some of these things, I guess, like your outlook on something when it's labeled terminal, like I guess how you even handle that, and I guess like when you were first diagnosed with MELAS, maybe like what your first impression, or what were your first thoughts?
Yeah, so um they came in and my mum was here. They'd asked her to be here and they told my mum to sit down. So I immediately knew something wasn't good. And when they said what I had, this mitochondrial condition, I was like, we finally have answers. Good. Like, I was so happy. I asked them, I was like, what do we do? What treatment can I take? What medication will work? And that's when, of course, they said there is nothing. And I just remember my stomach and my heart just dropped and it sank. And it was definitely a very scary moment for all of us. There was kind of bittersweet. Obviously, we have answers, yet it's not the answer anyone would ever want. But I'm very stubborn, and them saying, all these things like you're not going to get better, you're not going to do this, kind of lit this fire in me. Like, you don't know me, just you wait and see, and I will prove you wrong. I've done it before, and I'm going to do it again.
Yeah,
So that
absolutely.
continues to kind of be my outlook. I think that, I just need to get back in a boat. It's worked so many times before, and it's my happy place in training. And as I said, neuroplasticity and just obviously mental health wise, it's so important for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to following along with that transition. Is there, how do I want to phrase this? So sometimes we'll hear with like the disability or the adaptive space where disability is viewed as an inspiration. So it's a question that we've been asking some of the guests. Like, do you want to be considered inspirational, or what do you want to be known as an athlete?
I think sometimes it's hard when people call me inspirational or strong and things like that because I definitely get imposter syndrome and I'm like, well, I don't know, like, I haven't done everything and I'm quite hard on myself. And I'm like, I haven't won a Paralympic gold yet. And I think it is sometimes easy for people to say that to someone who's especially struggling or doing well. But at the same time, I just want to be viewed as any other athlete that's doing well. And with my story, I just want to share awareness of this condition, but also hope more than anything. And I don't tend to view myself as an inspiration, as I said, like I still feel I've got so much more to achieve before I deserve that title.
Have you met anyone else that has MELAS, or have you connected with anyone with the same diagnosis?
No, so as I said, it's mainly childhood, and unfortunately, when you do have it as a child, you die in early years. So I am a very rare case, one in the of the only in the world. So it's very hard to find people in a similar position, especially because I'm so still cognitively aware, which again is very rare for this disease. Normally, with the brain lesions, it does affect your cognitive processing, but so I'm just a bit of a rare case, bit of a miracle in their eyes at the moment.
What was maybe we can look at this through like a fitness lens. So you were participating in adaptive CrossFit as well. What do you think gyms need to do, I guess, to be more accessible and inclusive?
I think going into a gym in a wheelchair is quite daunting because you're surrounded by all these able-bodied people, doing different things. And I'm never good at asking for help, when equipment, I can't reach it or it's in the way and things like that. And I think some gyms are set up here that are very close together. So it's really hard to access certain things. I think the gym industry needs to be more aware of accessibility needs. So a lot of gyms local to me didn't have lifts or, one had a disabled toilet, but it was on the top floor and there was no lift to it. So there are these barriers still there. And I think, you know, I was an athlete before, so sport's always been what I've loved. And that's why I went back to it. And I think as someone who hasn't had that before and going in, as a less able person, it is difficult. And I think there just needs to be more awareness out there in a way of like, when they're planning the gyms, they need to think more of spacing and adaptations. And but then again, I also experience a lot of people kind of pity you in a way and they want to then overly help you. And sometimes you just want to get on with it yourself and test your own limits and barriers. And I'd be doing things and people would be watching like, should she be doing that? Like, is that okay? And that also really frustrated me because I just want to be seen as anyone else that goes to the gym. Like, I'm there to get fit, healthy, and feel good, just like
Yeah.
everyone else, no matter my ability.
Yeah, we talk about that as like a charity model of disability where people with disabilities are seen as someone less than who has to be helped by this able-bodied person. Knight in shining armor comes to save them, etc. And it's kind of how it's portrayed in like literature and movies a lot of the time. Whereas we want to like kind of normalize disability. Like you said, it's part of an educational process, and I think a lot of times people just aren't immersed alongside people with disabilities, so they don't even know how to act. It's like they feel like they're gonna say something wrong, or they're going to offend the individual if they even try to interact with them. So it's been a tough thing to navigate for sure.
Yeah, I feel like people don't always know what to say and they're walking on eggshells around you because, as you said, they don't want to say the wrong thing. But then something's overcompensate, and it does feel like they're looking down at you at times, and that is definitely hard, and it is still a barrier out there.
Did you find the coaches to be pretty accommodating with what you needed?
Yes, I was really lucky where the gym I joined is amazing, and they'd had a girl in a wheelchair similar age before, so they kind of learned from that experience too, and they were really good they did let me get on with it, and they were there to help, and it became a very friendly environment, which was really inviting. So then, I became excited to go to the gym. I wasn't nervous anymore, and I think I was very competitive. So, I was always challenging the able-bodied people to do things like chin-ups and everything like that, which was for me a very empowering thing to do.
What are your goals for 2024? What do you kind of see the next year looking like?
So obviously to get back in the GB team and qualify again and get back on the Paralympic pathway. And I'd like to attend the World Championships as well as get more involved in other sports. I'd like to get involved in obviously back to CrossFit and do the CrossFit Games, but also triathlon. I'd love to do para triathlon and really just try out all these sports that are out there because now I've got the opportunity to. I'd love to give, wheelchair rugby a go as well.
That's awesome. Yeah. What if people are listening and invested in your story? I guess how can they help you or how can they support you?
I guess it's all about spreading awareness. And I've tried to, through this journey, be a lot more open with the truth and, both the good and the bad. And I think trying to bring awareness to this rare mitochondrial disorder is really important, but also sharing my story of hope and hopefully, when I'm back in that boat and I'm back competing, showing people that no matter what kind of your disability is and no matter what you're told, it matters what you believe, not what everyone else believes. So I guess it's just help sharing my story and sharing what I'm doing. And, I'm trying to show people that it's always possible, especially in the fitness industry.
Yeah.
And I'm working on developing a kind of program for people near me who've gone through spinal injuries in the local spinal units to get into Paralympic sports and kind of join all these things that are out there, the pathways, which are really well funded, and you meet other people like you because I've never really met someone young and in a wheelchair until I started rowing with the Paralympic team.
How important do you think representation is in sport?
I think it's really important because I watched, the Paralympics all through my time kayaking and rowing, and I found it was incredible. And I was like, especially when I went through the injury and knowing that was there was really important. And if it wasn't so, put on TV more and things like that, then people might not know it's out there all the time. Like, I only knew because I did the sport before, and I think it needs to be shown more. And especially in the fitness industry, like personal trainers knowing more about how to do PT sessions with adapted athletes and how to accommodate their needs, but still reach those goals they want to have.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope more fitness professionals can view adaptive fitness from like a performance lens and not always like a rehabilitative lens. Like we make sure that we communicate that we're not doing like physical therapy. We're taking whatever your goal is. So if it's to get back in a boat, like, okay, what physical ability do you need to be successful with that? And then catering the workout to that. And I think a lot of people view disability and injury synonymously. So they're kind of afraid that they're going to hurt the individual, but at the same way, and I guess in the same lens, like if you just kind of take what the individual is able to do, what they need to be able to do, and kind of work towards that goal, it's not a whole lot different than training
For
people without
sure.
physical disabilities. So
Yeah, I agree. And I think as well, rehab is more, you're focusing on what you can't do, whereas sport, you're focusing on what you can do. And I think that's really important. Like for me, when I went back to the gym, got back in a boat, I felt like I was living again, not just existing. And I think that's really important for people out there to realize that sport, you're using any capability you have to get out there, have fun, and do what others are doing.
Yeah, that was a conversation that I've had with a client recently where long stint in rehabilitation after a stroke and kind of talking about how now like we're working on specific goals. It's not about recovering what you lost, but it's about like getting to where you want to be. So it's biking better, swimming better, doing the things that you want to accomplish. And I guess to a degree, you almost like have to kind of hit a reset button and reevaluate goals and like have something to work towards. But that's really no different than like every few years, I guess, from my career, I have a different goal and I want to work on something. And so I guess the injury is kind of the same way. We have a quote in the course that says like life does not end with a disability, it begins. Which is from like Ernst van Dyke, who's a famous wheelchair racer, who's won Boston a bunch of times, and that can be true. But I guess I'm just speaking on from experience of conversations that I've had with people. So
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think sport kind of got me that strength back. And every time I went back to training, my progress was so much more, but without me even realizing, like without me focusing on it, it came as kind of a secondary to me wanting to compete because I'm a very competitive person. And as you said, like goals do change, and mine changed from the Olympics to the Paralympics, but it's still my goal at the end of the day. And obviously, I'm still doing the same sport, but it's slightly different, and it's had to be adapted. But I can still do it.
yeah, yeah, the coverage on the last Paralympics games I think was really important, and I'm sure Paris will have equal amounts of television presence and stuff. At least in the states, they made a really strong push with the most recent games to document and show more of it, and I think that's really played a large role. I guess I see like more track and field inclusion and diversity in some of these larger meets in the states here. So I hope that trend continues, obviously, and give adaptive athletes the platform that they deserve.
For sure. I mean, we had Wimbledon this summer, the big tennis tournament, and it was the first time they really televised the wheelchair tennis, which is a truly remarkable sport. I mean, they're so talented in what they do, and I think it was a big step in the right direction for tennis at such a big event as well. I think it was really good.
Absolutely. Maybe as one other question that we sometimes ask our guests, like, do you have any disdain towards the word disabled? Are you comfortable considering yourself someone with a disability, or do you like a different terminology? Because I think that's one thing that a lot of people get hung up on when communicating with people with disabilities is like the jargon and the terminology.
For sure. I think it took me a long time to accept that word. Um, and now I kind of own it. And I know it took a long time for my mum to accept it. She said, no, you're not disabled. But at the same time, I am, but I tend to more say I'm less able, or I I mean disabled we do use, but I tend to avoid it in all honesty, especially when it comes to sport. I use the word adapted a lot.
Yeah.
I'm an adapted rower. I'm not,
Yeah.
a disabled rower. I'm adapted because it's just
Yeah.
a little bit
Yeah.
different. But
Para, and adaptive seem like they're perfectly useful terms, I guess, in that scenario. And I can't really envision like any scenarios in conversation where I would have to say, "Oh, that's the disabled athlete and that's the able-bodied athlete." It's just, I think sometimes you hear both sides of the like coin with some of the terminology, and I think it often presents or prevents people from even communicating with someone with a disability because they're afraid that they're going to offend. So I don't know if there's really an answer to like clarifying some of that. It seems like every person I ask has a slightly different opinion. But at the end of the day, like you said, you don't really need to have that term, I guess, labeled to you. You can be a para athlete, you can be a para rower, you can be an adaptive athlete. So it's just a
yeah,
question that I like to hear firsthand, I guess, examples of it, and hear from you instead of me bestowing upon other people what my thoughts are. So. Georgia, thank you for sharing your story. We'll be pulling for you, and I'll make sure we link the your profiles and stuff, and if anyone wants to follow along with your return to Paralympic sport. But again, really appreciate you joining us from overseas here and sharing your story.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you so much.